So this is the title of my talk. I want to start first, though, with I want to give some balance because I'm talking about public housing in New York City, and there's a lot of negative press about people who live in public housing, and the mainstream media talks about a lot about the problems in public housing, gangs and drugs, and that there are problems with that. But I just want to give people balance before I get into the smoking ban, so that you see that public housing, the people who live there, there's complexity there. It's not all one thing. There's about, in New York City public housing, there's about 400,000 people who live in buildings across the 5 boroughs, over 300 developments that people live in. So that's a lot of people. And the organization that runs public housing is called New York City Housing Authority. And so for short, I call it NYCHA. So that's the word that I'll be using. And really, public housing is a community. Hundreds of thousands of people live there, and it's a community. And it's a community where people look out for one another. There is a sense of solidarity in the face of some very difficult living conditions, which I don't have time to talk about. And it's also, public housing is a place where, this is from one of the buildings that I was in. These are my photographs. These are what some of the buildings look like. And it's also, public housing and the communities that public housing are in is a place where culture is created and celebrated. So these are some of the murals that I've taken photos of in the community that I'm working in, and they're really, really beautiful. The other thing that you have to know about public housing is that it's the birthplace of hip hop. Some of the most important rap artists lived in public housing, and their songs talk about the reality of living in public housing, the good, the bad, and everything. So I want people to just have a balance when you think about the folks who live in public housing. I think that's really important, because what you get from the mainstream media is only one small part of it. So who lives in public housing? Well, you have to be low income. To get into public housing, you can't make a lot of money. So people who don't have a lot of resources living in public housing. We also know there's a disproportionate amount of people who have mental health problems, everything from schizophrenia to depression, people who have used drugs, people who are still using drugs, people in recovery, and people who were formerly homeless. One of the ways in New York City people get housing is through NYCHA, because it is less expensive to live in public housing. So you have a concentration of what we call vulnerable groups living in public housing. And so then along comes a ban, a smoke. Now NYCHA housing is going completely smoke-free. You can no longer smoke in your apartment. So the other thing about vulnerable populations is they have the highest rates of smoking in the United States. So here's a problem, here's a real problem. You have a lot of people who have been smoking for many, many years, and now they're told they can't smoke in their apartments. And in fact, they have to go outside and go 25 feet away from the building in order to have a cigarette. And that is enormously problematic, because if you look at the reality of day-to-day life in many NYCHA buildings, the buildings are falling apart. Elevators don't work, sometimes for days on end. So if you're a smoker and you use a wheelchair or other assistive devices, if you're a frail elderly person, if you have cognitive deficits, how do you get out of the building to go have a cigarette? And if you want to comply, which I'm sure a lot of people want to comply with the ban, how do you get out of the building? That's a huge problem in a lot of NYCHA housing projects. If it's night, if it's midnight, and you want to go out and have a cigarette, some buildings are in high crime areas, and vulnerable populations, women in particular, people with disabilities and wheelchairs, they're vulnerable to crime. And so, again, if you want to go out and have a cigarette, it's midnight, 1 o'clock, that is a risk, and that's not something the ban takes into account, I don't believe. And also weather. People don't think about that, but there's no place if you go outside, if it's raining, if it's snowing, extreme weather. In New York City, we have temperatures sometimes that are really, really high, and public health officials tell people to stay inside air-conditioned apartments. And you're gonna go out and have a cigarette. And so it's enormously problematic on a lot of levels for people from these vulnerable groups. So I think, well, I agree with everybody should have clean air to breathe. The dangers of smoke, secondhand smoke are real. But the problem is quitting for vulnerable groups is much harder than for other groups. We know this. We know, for example, a lot of the people I've worked with, numerous attempts at quitting, and they haven't been successful. So the stakes are really high now for people who live in NYCHA buildings because eviction is on the table. So you can be evicted. Individuals and entire families can now be evicted for smoking in their apartment, smoking in common areas, smoking anywhere where it's banned. And that, to me, is absolutely unacceptable. It's unethical, and it's setting people up to be homeless because we know that many NYCHA residents, if they were evicted, they will be homeless, they will end up in shelters. They're not gonna go get a brand new, beautiful apartment. That's not gonna happen. So here's where we have to talk about what the alternative. This is Spike, a friend of mine. She owns Vape NY, and we've partnered together. I'm sorry, I'm seeing it on my computer, you're not seeing it. This is Spike. And so we were talking about what's happening in NYCHA. She told me people from NYCHA had come over to her smoke shop, which is her vape shop, which is right across the street from NYCHA housing development. And people there had come and said, we need to transition, we can't smoke anymore. And she helped them do that. And so I said, I'm gonna go over there and try to meet some people to see if I could do a tobacco harm reduction group for them. And so that's what I did. I went over there and I met with the building manager, I met with the president of the Tenants Association. They invited us to their World Tobacco World Free Day. And we went there and Spike brought some vaping products and she demonstrated them for people, tried to have some conversations. And then here are some photos of the Tobacco Free World Day, and just meeting people, finding out where they're at, trying to have conversations, finding out if people are vaping, that sort of thing. And then, I'm sorry, okay, let's get to the next one. So then I met with the president of the Tenants Association. I said, what do you think about me doing a tobacco harm reduction vaping group for tenants? She thought, that's a great idea. We're talking about that because this is where the work has to be done, right? These are the groups that have the highest rates of smoking, the highest rates of death and disease from smoking, and they're really being neglected, I think, not only in New York City, but probably everywhere. We're not looking at this problem. And so that for me is the work, and this is where we have to go, especially with the ban that has just, that went into effect in 2018. So it's really, really important, I think, that we go there, meet people where they're at, and offer them, tobacco harm reduction vaping groups, and also, again, partnering with Spike and her vape shop. That is a place, right, for people to come and get education, get support. If their products don't work, they can troubleshoot them. They can buy their vaping liquid there. And it's a center of support and education and camaraderie for people. So that's really what this is all about. So in these groups, I want to offer people a variety of products. Recently, IQOS got FDA approval. I want to get IQOS into the hands of products. I want the people in public housing to have access to all of the amazing tobacco harm reduction products that are on the market. Zyn, this could be helpful for people as well. And then this is what some people that I work with have told me over and over again, and I really believe it. We have the potential to save the lives of millions of people, and that's what it's all about, I think, in terms of tobacco harm reduction. I just want to end with support, don't punish, because we punish smokers, and we have to stop doing that. We have to support people who smoke and support them in making the transition to vaping. The punishment has to stop. Thank you.